You're the one who remembered the reservation. You're the one who noticed when someone went quiet at the party and checked in on them later. You're the one who drove, who planned, who held the details in your head so nobody else had to. And if you're being honest, you didn't even think twice about it. It just felt like you. Like that was simply your role, and everyone kind of knew it, and you kind of knew it, and nobody ever really talked about it because there was nothing to talk about. It worked. People relied on you. Things got done. But here's the moment I want you to think about. The moment you needed something. Not something dramatic. Just help. A little support. Someone to notice that you were tired, and instead of asking, you just handled it yourself and told yourself that was fine, that you preferred it that way, that you didn't want to be a burden. And somewhere underneath that, there was this low hum of something you couldn't quite name. Because what nobody talks about is what it costs to be the one who never needs anything. Hey, I'm Martin. If this is hitting close to home, you're probably going to want to stick around for this one. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. It actually helps more than you think. So here's what most people get wrong about this. They look at the responsible one in a friend group and they think, that person has it together. They're capable. They're the glue. And the responsible one usually agrees with that story, because it's not entirely untrue. But what that framing completely misses is the question of how that role got there in the first place. Because here's the thing, nobody is born the responsible one. That pattern was built. Slowly, quietly, and usually for very good reasons. And the fact that it looks like a personality trait on the outside is exactly what makes it so difficult to examine. From the outside, you look organized, dependable, calm under pressure. You're the one people call when something goes wrong. You show up, you follow through. And people love that about you. They genuinely do. But from the inside, it's a different experience. From the inside, it feels less like confidence and more like a kind of low-grade vigilance. Like part of your brain is always slightly scanning, tracking who's okay, who's not, what needs to happen, what might go wrong. You can be at a dinner, having a good time, laughing, and still be running a quiet background process that's monitoring everyone at the table. Not because you're anxious necessarily, just because you learned a long time ago that paying attention was your job. And here's what nobody tells you about that. It's exhausting in a way that's almost impossible to explain because you're never exactly doing anything. The exhaustion doesn't come from a single task. It comes from the constant hum of awareness that never fully powers down. What's actually happening here is something psychologists call parentification. And before that word makes you think this doesn't apply to you, let me explain what it actually means. It doesn't require a chaotic or absent parent. It doesn't require obvious neglect or trauma in the dramatic sense. Parentification, a concept formalized in family systems research, particularly through the work of Salvador Minuchin in the 1970s, describes what happens when a child takes on emotional or logistical responsibility that exceeds their developmental role. Sometimes that's because a parent was struggling. Sometimes it's because they were the oldest. Sometimes it's because they were just sensitive. They picked up on tension in the room before anyone said a word, and they learned that managing that tension was how they kept the peace and how they felt safe. And that last part is the part most people miss entirely. This wasn't just about being helpful, it was a survival strategy. The responsible role gave you something: predictability, a sense of control, a way to feel needed and therefore secure. The problem is that the nervous system doesn't just use that strategy at home as a kid and then retire it at 18. It generalizes. It carries it forward into friendships, into relationships, into your entire sense of what your role is supposed to be wherever you go. And the brain is actually doing something quite clever here, in its own limited way. If you grew up in an environment where emotional needs were unpredictable, or where depending on someone felt risky, your nervous system made a reasonable calculation. If I am useful, I am safe. If I am needed, I will not be abandoned. If I manage everything around me, I preserve some control over an environment that otherwise felt uncontrollable. Researcher and author Dr. Jonice Webb calls a version of this childhood emotional neglect Not necessarily abuse, but the consistent gap between what a child needed emotionally and what was available. And one of the most common adaptations to that gap is to stop needing. To become so capable that needing feels unnecessary, or even dangerous. Think about what that actually means for a second. You didn't become the responsible one because you're naturally selfless. You became the responsible one because, at some point, being responsible was the safest version of yourself you could find. That's not a personality flaw, that's a nervous system response. But here's where it gets really interesting and uncomfortable. Because that strategy has costs. Not dramatic, visible costs. Quiet ones. Over time, the person who never asks for help starts to accumulate a kind of invisible resentment. Not because they're ungrateful or bitter, but because humans have needs, and when those needs are consistently unmet, they don't disappear. They go underground. Research published in the journal Emotion found that people who habitually suppress their own emotional needs show elevated physiological stress responses even when they report feeling fine. Your body is keeping a different account than your self-narrative. The other cost is loneliness. And this is the specific, ironic loneliness of the responsible one. You are surrounded by people who need you, and completely alone in the experience of not being needed back. Not because people don't care about you, but because you've never let them show up for you in a way that counts. You deflect. You say you're fine. You minimize what you're going through. And so the people around you, who are probably good people, have no idea that anything is missing. The role you built to keep you safe has become a wall you can't see from the inside. And this is where the identity thing becomes genuinely tricky. Most people who grew up as the responsible one don't experience this as a role they play. They experience it as who they are. Being capable, being self-sufficient, being the one who holds it together. That doesn't feel like a behavior. It feels like a core truth about themselves. It's a bit like being the load-bearing wall in a house. The wall doesn't know it's load-bearing, it just knows that everything rests on it. And that's been true for so long that the wall has started to think, this is simply what walls are for. The idea of not holding anything up doesn't feel like relief. It feels like structural collapse. And so when someone suggests they might want to let go of some of that responsibility, it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like an identity threat. Like, if I'm not the responsible one, what am I? If I ask for help, who am I then? That's not a small question. And the uncomfortable truth is that most people never actually sit with it. They just keep doing what they've always done because the doing, at least, feels certain. So here's where most people go completely wrong. They read something like this, or they have a moment of recognition, and they think, okay, I need to ask for help more. I need to let people in. I need to practice being vulnerable. And then they try it once, it feels awful, the other person doesn't respond the way they hoped, and they conclude that they were right all along. That it's just easier to handle things themselves, and that failure gets filed as evidence. But the reason that approach fails isn't weakness or bad timing. It's neuroscience. The responsible role isn't a habit you can just decide to update through conscious intention. It's a deeply encoded safety response. And the brain treats it accordingly. When you try to ask for help, the nervous system doesn't experience that as growth. It experiences it as threat. The same system that learned being needed equals safe now interprets needing others equals vulnerable equals dangerous. So you feel the anxiety, you don't get the perfect response, and your brain says, see? We were right to handle it ourselves. One conscious decision can't override years of encoded threat response. That's not how neurological change works. What actually works is slower and less dramatic than a single moment of vulnerability. It starts with something researchers call titrated exposure, which is just a clinical way of saying, practice being a little bit needy in situations where the stakes are low enough that your nervous system doesn't immediately file it as a catastrophe. Not one big, meaningful ask. Dozens of small, almost boring ones. Let someone pick the restaurant. Don't quietly reroute them when they choose the place you wouldn't have chosen. Text someone when you're having a bad day instead of waiting until you've already handled it. Let the silence sit instead of filling it with helpfulness. These aren't grand gestures. They're data points. And what your nervous system is doing, slowly, is updating its prediction. Building a new file of evidence that says, I needed something small and the world didn't end, and I didn't lose the person. Dr. Sue Johnson's research on emotionally focused therapy is pretty clear on this. Deep attachment patterns don't shift through insight. They shift through corrective emotional experience. Your nervous system doesn't believe what you understand. It believes what you repeatedly live through. The other piece, and this is the one most self-help content skips entirely, is grief. At some point, you have to actually feel how much this cost you. Not to dramatize it, not to build a story around it, but to acknowledge that somewhere along the way, a younger version of you decided their needs were less important than everyone else's stability. That kid was doing the best they could with what they had, and they deserved more ease than they got. That's not a therapy exercise, it's just an honest reckoning. Because the patterns that run from underneath don't need your understanding. They need to be felt. Here's where this lands. The responsible one in the friend group usually ends up in one of two places eventually. Either they keep being the responsible one, competent, relied upon, quietly depleted, until something in them stops or breaks or goes very still. Or they go through the uncomfortable process of becoming someone who also takes up space, who also needs things, who is sometimes uncertain, sometimes asks, sometimes doesn't have the answer. And that version, if it's the one who exists beyond the role, that's the person most of the people in your life have never actually met. Whether they're ready for them is one question. Whether you're ready to find out is another.